State of Ohio. I drove all the way here from Knoxville, Tennessee, to come speak with you all today. My topic is blue teaming on a budget of zero, and it comes from over 10 years of being an InfoSec practitioner, a blue teamer my whole life. I'm the principal consultant at Cybersecurity. My name is Kyle Bubp. So I wanted to give an agenda today, just kind of so you know what you're walking into, and maybe you want to walk out, I don't know. So I'm going to give a high-level overview of building a security program. I'm going to mention some free and open-source tools that you can use while you're building your program. Again, it's not going to be down in the weeds, so if that's what you're looking for, feel free to leave. I mean, I'm not going to be offended if you don't want to listen to it. That's cool. And I'm going to give some real-world experience and some fun stories on the things that I've run into in my career. So a little bit about who I am. Like I said, I've been in InfoSec for almost, a little over 10 years now. The majority of my experience, I was a Department of Defense contractor. I worked with the FBI for a little bit. I worked with the Department of Energy. And then I realized there were a lot of inefficiencies in the federal government, so I figured I'd leave. I went to a Berkshire Hathaway company to lead their incident response program, built their vulnerability management program. I basically did a lot of stuff there. Left there to go to an international hosting company, and we'll have to talk about that when I'm not on the record. But I left there to go lead the security practice at a VAR, and through all of my experience, I got to talk to a lot of different customers, see a lot of different things, figure out a lot of different ways that people were doing things wrong, but also doing the right way. And so I wanted to compile all of that information and experience and give it out to folks who don't jump around jobs every 2 years like I do. So everyone can benefit from that. Outside of work, I love riding motorcycles and being outdoors. And like I said, I live in Knoxville, Tennessee with my wife and my 2 dogs. And it dawned on me that I probably should have a picture of the dogs, but I don't. So just imagine, if you will, like the cutest dogs that you could ever imagine, and that's what my dogs look like. So more often than not, the organizations that I've worked in, this does not represent our security budget accurately. In fact, the majority of the time, the C-level executives or management is asking for us to be 100% secure, but they don't want to dedicate any funds to that. And just out of my curiosity, how many of you are in a management position or higher? Excellent. I'm not crap on you guys. I just wanted to understand my audience. How about red teamers, penetration testers, stuff like that? All right. And how about blue teamers, practitioners, defenders? Sweet. So an awesome mix. More often than not, our budget looks more similar to this, where we have a lot of goals to meet, and all we have really are ourselves and the labor that we can put into it. But that's okay. I mentioned that I used to work for a VAR leading security practice, so I'm very familiar with the vendor space and what some of these vendor offerings are. And I can tell you that the majority of the benefits that you get from buying these tools, they also exist in open source tools. So don't feel bad if you can't go out and buy the latest next-gen AV or next-gen firewall or whatever the next-gen dark web searching technology that comes out is, because more likely, you don't really need it. So this is the Burj Khalifa, and it's the tallest building in the world, and you don't build something like this without a strong foundation. So if we think about a security program and building a security program, we want to look at the foundation first. I've been in organizations where there was no thought given to what framework we're going to use, how we're going to metricize what we're doing, how we're going to test the controls we have in place, and instead these organizations, they go out and they buy things like FireEye or something like Palo Alto Wildfire, and they don't even know why they're doing that. They just know that the sales guy told them that it's going to protect you against all of the unknown bad stuff in your network, which is fine. Those are cool products, but again, we're talking about a budget of zero, and obviously you can't buy that with zero budget. So looking at the foundation of a good security program, I found a couple different tools throughout my career. Being in the government, we use a lot of NIST framework, NIST documentation, such as the 853 and the Cybersecurity Framework. But I really believe that the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, in conjunction with the CIS 20, is where you should start. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework lays out a lot of the groundwork as far as policy and procedure, things like that. And then the CIS 20 kind of gives you a way to metricize, to test the efficacy of your tools. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but for me, biggest bang for your buck, that's where you should really start. And if you haven't looked at these controls, take a minute, go research them, check them out, read through them, see what they're all about. I don't like reading, so I found this tool, which is the NIST CSF tool. You can walk through the cybersecurity framework. It's a visual, obviously. So any of these you can just click on, you can dig right into it. But obviously, and you can see kind of the stages of building a security program. You have identification, protection, detection, responding, stuff like that. And then down here at the bottom, it maps to different regulatory standards, and one of them is the CSC 20. This is really important. I've been in a lot of organizations where documentation has not been a focus. And I will say that as practitioners, whether you're blue teamers, red teamers, management, documentation is extremely important because you're not the only person that's ever going to do the task that you're currently doing. Somebody's going to come in behind you and have to do it as well. And if it's all up in your head, that's not good for anybody. So I recommend implementing a wiki, something like MediaWiki, which is free, or you can use Atlassian's Confluence, which is $10 for under 10 users. So if you're a small team, which most of us are in small security teams, $10 can get you an awesome wiki where you can document all of your controls. And Confluence even has some plugins like Glyphy. So if you're familiar with Visio, diagramming, stuff like that, Glyphy is a plugin for Confluence where you can build your diagrams within Confluence. And, I put these incident response ticketing software up here as well because it's really important to have that before you get into an incident because at some point you will have to work an incident, and the worst time to document an incident or try to find a framework to do ticketing and documentation is when you're working an incident. So have these tools up and ready, something like RTIR or the Hive. The Hive is actually a lot easier to install, so it's just an RPM package or a Debian package. RTIR takes a little bit more configuration, but I urge you to have this in place. So now that we've got all the boring documentation stuff out of the way, let's talk about the technical details of building a strong security program. And by the way, if you haven't had one of these yet, they're amazing. So go get yourself a Bloody Mary. Thank you back there. So if you don't map out your network, it's kind of impossible for you to know if your controls are actually being effective. Because let's say you do have the budget to buy something like, Carbon Black, but you don't know what assets are on your network. How can you be sure that you're getting 100% coverage with this tool that you purchased to prevent malware? So step one is map out your entire network. One of the tools I like to do to use this is a tool called NetDB. The way it works is that you'll create a service account more or less for all of your network gear. And NetDB will go out, it'll SSH to your network gear. It'll pull down your ARP tables, IP addresses, VLANs, put it in a nice web interface for you to use. So now you know every switch on your network, every access point, every firewall, everything that's plugged into that device, you can have it in a nice web interface where you can say, hey, what's plugged in on port 20 on switch 13? It'll tell you exactly the IP address, the host name. It'll try to do an OUI lookup on the Mac if it can. So that's a good way to map it all out. But additionally, with NetDB, because it's a Linux utility, you can do some cool stuff with alerting. So you can set up a cron job, and this is actually something we did with one of our customers recently. We set up a cron job that would scan the NetDB database every hour. And if anything changed within that hour, it would pipe it to the mail command and then send that in an email to the network administrators and say, hey, you have a new device in your network. It's at this switch port. Here's the IP address. Here's the host name. So that way, when something comes on your network, you can be aware within 1 hour. So I don't know how many of you out there can say that within 1 hour you know of a new IP address coming on your network, but all the places that I've worked at, we couldn't do that. Even with something like SolarWinds, it was just, we weren't able to do that, which I think, knowing something that comes on your network is critical. And I'll tell you a story as to why that's critical. I used to work in an organization. We probably had about 4,000 endpoints, large building, multiple conference rooms, and we had just started to roll out Wi-Fi. And so we were testing on internal IT first. And it got out that internal IT had Wi-Fi. And so our users started asking for Wi-Fi and said, oh, no, we can't do that right now. We're still testing it. We're trying to get the certificates right, stuff like that. Well, those conference rooms I mentioned, they all had jacks in them. And unfortunately, all the jacks were hot. So one of the users came in one day, and they plugged in a Linksys router and gave Wi-Fi access to all their friends. Well, that on the other end of that was our internal network, an RFC 1918 network. So essentially, this person had just created an open Wi-Fi access point for anyone to come by and log directly into our network. And oh, by the way, we didn't have segmentation either, so workstations and servers were just a flat network. So, if we had something like NetDB in place that was alerting us when something new came online, we would have seen that immediately. Now, thankfully, we were using, I believe it was Aruba, and we had Air Marshal turned on, so we were able to see that rogue access point. But if you didn't have those technologies, who knows how long that could have sat there, and who knows who could have connected to our network, and we would have never known. Now, of course, that's not the only tool that's out there that you can map your network with. There are other tools. You could actually use Nmap for this. So you could just do Nmap scans, create a cron job to do that, and then do a diff on the two scans. And if there's something new, obviously alert yourself. NetDisco is another one that's very similar to what NetDB does, but instead of using SSH to log into all your switches, it just uses SNMP. Now, I mentioned earlier mapping out your network, Visio diagrams, stuff like that. That's extremely important. I was working an incident one time, and I asked the network administrators if they had a Visio diagram of their network. And they said, okay, hold on, we'll get you something. And what they came back with was an Excel spreadsheet of IP addresses and host names, which was really not helpful at all. So I know as security practitioners, you could make the argument that it's not our job, but that's not necessarily the attitude you want to have when you're trying to kind of lend the olive branch, so to speak. So if you don't have a network map in your environment and you have some downtime, it'd probably be a good idea to start mapping out your network. Your network admins will thank you for it. I know it's not fun, but it's important. So now that we know about all the assets on our network, we kind of want to figure out what's going on those assets. Things like, what's installed on those assets, what processes are running on those assets. And Facebook has developed a really awesome tool called OS Query, which can give you all of the information you would ever want on any of your assets. It works on Mac, Windows, Linux. It's very similar. Are any of you familiar with the software Teamin? So it can do a lot of what Teamin can do. I will say that Teamin is probably a little easier to set up. But imagine, if you will, that you could query OS Query. So let's say you take all the logs from OS Query and you put them in something like the Elastic Stack. And now you can query your Elastic Stack, all your workstations, and say, okay, I know this new Java 0-day came out. Tell me all of the workstations that have this specific version of Java on them. And it'll return you all of that data, which is extremely powerful. But you can also use it for, IOC hunting. So I don't know how many of you are signed up to get the, the FBI flash bulletins, but a lot of times they'll just give you a bunch of file hashes. You can actually search those file hashes within your environment with OS Query, and it'll come back and tell you all the machines that have matching hashes. So if you're doing, some of that low-level threat hunting, so to speak, it's extremely helpful. And speaking of discovering everything on your network, how many of you have users on your network? Yeah, all of you. And how many of those users have access to file shares? All of them. So another story. This is a story about discovering what users put on those file shares, and the tool I used was OpenDLP. And the way this works, it's very simple. You can actually just download an OVA. But you just point out your file shares. You'll create a user account for it to use within Active Directory, and it'll go out and scan all your file shares. So I ran this in an environment, actually the same environment with that Wi-Fi access point that was plugged into that hot jack. Anyway, I ran this in that environment. I just asked the admins, I said, just give me a normal user account. Don't give me any special permissions, because I wanted to see what everyone had access to. So OpenDLP, it goes out and churns to the file shares. And as it turns out, I was able to find some pretty interesting information. For one, that company used to sell stock to its employees internally, and then had since been acquired by another company. Well, all of that data, how many shares everyone owned, how much they got bought out for, their name, their address, everything, all of that data was accessible if you could find the right folder. And this is just by a normal user. The other thing I found, which is even more interesting, it appeared to be the CEO of the company's admin assistant. She had created a notepad document, and it was almost like a black book, so to speak, but it had the CEO's name, address, social security number, home phone number, his dad's name, social security number, home phone number, all of their children. Now, I don't know why you would need this information, but it also had the corporate credit card on there, and there were multiple corporate credit cards. Like I said, it had social security numbers, and it had date of birth for everyone. So I would implore you, if you don't know what's on your network as far as file shares, run OpenDLP over the weekend and just see what happens. Just see what you can find. Because I would guarantee that there is stuff out there that you don't know is out there that shouldn't be out there. And then, once you do find that stuff, it's really just trying to track down the data owners, working with the data owners to figure out, okay, does this need to be here? If not, what can we do about it? Stuff like that. So, again, the importance of discovering what's on your network is key to security. And I know, we're not getting into anything like cool and sexy and like red team hacker stuff right now, but I feel like if you don't know what's on your network and you don't know what users are doing on your network, it's kind of hard to put in security controls. So now that we know what's on our network, it's time to harden it. It's time to go hard. How many of you are familiar with the CIS benchmarks? So out of the box, Windows 10 is 22% compliance with the CIS benchmark. And the reason for this is, Microsoft, Apple, they want to make their devices as accessible to users as possible. And so accessibility means let's turn on everything, even if you don't need it, because we never know if you might need it. But in the enterprise, you guys pretty much know what you need and what you don't need. So with the CIS benchmarks, you can actually run a tool called Syscat against your devices, and you can see how they match up, and you also get recommendations on how to fix them. And all of the CIS benchmarks, they're public information. Just search for CIS benchmarks. But the reason for implementing these, and and the government used this as STIGs, but configuration management is extremely important. It's really hard to secure an organization where everything's a snowflake. Wendy talked earlier about snowflakes and how they're hard to patch. And, if you have no configuration management, if you don't know what's out there, it's hard to say with confidence that when that next round of patches rolls out, when Patch Tuesday rolls out, it's hard to say with confidence it's not going to break anything. So I think the CIS benchmarks goes into that configuration management, and by aligning your machines with CIS benchmarks, it takes care of some of the red team tools, such as Responder. If you have a machine that's configured with CIS benchmarks, it's going to be really difficult for those red teamers to use Responder because it's going to turn off something like link local multicast name resolution or net bias name resolution, things like that. It's going to turn on SMB signing. The other thing it's going to do, how many of you are familiar with Microsoft Laps? So CIS benchmark implores you to deploy Microsoft Laps. And for those of you who are not familiar with Microsoft Laps, it essentially allows you to randomize the local admin password on all of your workstations and then give access to those passwords to a set group of people like your help desk staff. And the benefit of this is that it makes lateral movement a little more difficult for attackers and penetration testers. Change management is also extremely important when we're talking about configuration management. So the hosting provider I used to work at, we were all Linux, and we used Puppet for our not only our configuration management, but we took the Puppet configurations and we put them in Git. So now we have change management as well. We can go back and track changes. And that was extremely important when we were trying to troubleshoot things that, someone had rolled out a new Puppet config and we didn't know why it was breaking something. Well, we could just go back through Git and see what the changes were. And another reason why change management is important is because changes break stuff. And, I got to Ohio yesterday, and I was staying with a friend, and he was telling me a story about how they were decommissioning servers. The change was approved, but the process really wasn't in place on how to actually decommission the servers. So these were blade servers, and they were all mapped back to a fiber channel LUN. And part of the change was we're going to use D-band on these servers to make sure there's no sensitive data left on them. Well, because the LUNs were still mapped to the servers, D-band went out and just shredded through the SAN. And so these VMs that were up, now they only exist in cache. So if the VM gets rebooted, they go down. So unfortunately, that is the case of if you have poor processes in place and poor change management, you're probably going to bring something down. So I know that, in most security talks, we don't talk about change management and process improvement, but it's extremely important as a practitioner because things can go sour really quickly if you don't plan things out. So I'd like to think that this guy is walking towards the risk because he's going to remediate it instead of being happy about it. But it's important to know the risk in your network. Otherwise, what are we doing as practitioners? I don't know. So I know that you're probably all familiar with Nessus and Rapid7's Nexpose or Nexpose if you're fancy. But OpenVAS is actually a fork of Nessus, still maintained. It's actually the default vulnerability scanner in Alien Vault, and it works really well. If you have no budget, download OpenVAS, or I think the front end is called Greenbone. But you can use this to scan your network for vulnerabilities. And I actually did a scan of my own network. So this is an example of my home network. So I guess come at me, bro. I don't know. But it's a cautionary tale, really, of scanning devices. And that is, when I scanned my network, I saw some IPs here I didn't really recognize. And I wanted to log into my router to see what they were. And I couldn't log into my router because it crashed the web browser on my router. So keep in mind that if you're scanning your network, there is the potential to bring down things. I was talking the other day to a customer who is a medical university, and they had devices on their network that not only can they not patch, that we were talking about earlier, because the manufacturer of these these medical devices say if you patch this, we're not going to support it. So go forward, and it's probably going to break something too. But also think about the risk of scanning them. Think about in a hospital. If you have people hooked up to these machines that are basically providing them life support, and you scan it with OpenVAS, and suddenly it turns off their their iron lung. Are iron lungs still a thing? I don't know, but let's pretend that they are for this example. You don't want your vulnerability scan to basically kill somebody, so keep that in mind. I know in Nessus you can enable safe checks, and OpenVAS you can do the same thing. So maybe your first time out of the gate, just do some safe checks first, so we're not murdering anyone. But we can also scan our web applications, and although that Nessus and OpenVAS can scan web applications, there are some better scanners suited just for web applications. So I recently have been using the Iraqi Framework, which is awesome. It scores very high on most of the open source tests as well. You're probably all familiar with OWASP Zap. That's a good one to use. Nikto is more of a configuration scanner. It's not going to dig in. I really like Burp Suite. It's not free. There is a free version, but you can't do the full scanning. But if you have $350, you can use Burp Suite. And for a full comparison, you can go to sectoolmarket.com. But here is a example of the Iraqi Framework. So not only does it give you where the vulnerabilities lie on your web apps, but there's also a way that you can kind of review with your developers. So there's a discussion tab here and a review tab here. So you can kind of use it as a whole bug tracking system as well. So when you find vulnerabilities in your developer's code, you can start a ticket with them, a conversation with them, and say, hey, this is what I found, what are we going to do to fix it, etc. In addition to fixing code, you can also configure your web servers to kind of be resilient against attacks. So when I worked with the Department of Energy, we had fail to ban and mod security installed on all of our Apache web servers. Mod security actually works for IIS and Apache now. So if you're running IIS web servers, there's really no reason not to be running mod security on top of them as well. We're talking about a WAF essentially inside of the web server. All right, it's time to patch it. Let's patch it all, right? I mean, anytime somebody gets breached, we want to talk about doing the basics. Can't even do the basics, right? I don't understand why we can't do the basics. You would think that perhaps Wendy and I worked on this presentation together, but we didn't. It's just being a practitioner, I'm tired of hearing, oh, why didn't you just do the basics? Like, I would invite you, like, I totally respect what pen testers do, and I wish I were that cool. I'm not. I can't, like, I don't even know how to use Metasploit, just flat out. But come into the environment that I've worked in, where politics plays a huge issue, uptime plays a huge issue. You know, if I come to the business and say, hey, I need to patch these servers, I know it's your main source of revenue, and you like want to be making profit and stuff, but we found this vulnerability, and it could be really bad. You know, more often than not, the C-levels are going to say, that's nice, security guy, but we're here to make some cheddar. So, you know, maybe we'll save that for another time. So, you know, that's not to say that patching isn't important. We all know patching is important. I mean, that's how, you know, most vulnerabilities are exploited. It's a missing patch. But it's not always easy. And I think, you know, Twitter is like a dumpster fire for anytime someone gets breached, you know, people want to come out and say, oh, they should have just patched. It's like, I get it. Yes, they should have. We all understand that. However, it's not that simple. But for the things you can patch, if you're in a Windows environment, you can use something like Windows Server Update Services. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. That takes care of Windows and Microsoft products. But what about third-party products, such as, you know, your Adobes and your Javas of the world? Well, PDQ Deploy has a free tool that you can use to roll out all of your third-party patches as well. They also have a paid version, but we're talking about a budget of $0, so you can use your free version to do this. Now, obviously, anything free is going to be a little more work on your part to get it up and running, but this is a way that you can patch your third-party applications within your Windows environments. You know, for your Linux environments, you're going to use, you know, Yum or Aptitude, depending on what distro you're using. But I think you really need to tie these in with a configuration management platform such as Chef and Puppet as well, so you can control what patches are in your environment. You know, configuration management is not just about software bloat, but it's also about making sure that you know exactly what packages are deployed where, and you can do that easily with Chef and Puppet. And you can also use these in a Windows environment as well, but I've never seen anybody use Chef or Puppet in a Windows environment, even though you could. So with all of this data, we need to be putting it somewhere. So in the case of an incident or an event, we need to be able to go back and look through these logs. And, you know, honestly, centralized logging makes everything easier. So I don't know if you're familiar, but Microsoft Windows actually has this built into their platform. It's called Windows Event Subscriptions. So you can pipe them all to a central Windows server, but most folks don't do that. They're really going to ship off their logs. You know, if you're a Linux environment, you're probably going to ship them off to an rsyslog server. Or you can use something like the Elastic Stack and ship off all your logs to that. Now, there are some issues with scale with the Elastic Stack. Once you get past a certain threshold, you know, if you're not running solid-state drives and have a crap ton of memory, it's going to take forever for you to pour through your logs. But I still think the Elastic Stack is a pretty good option for dumping your logs into a small to medium-sized environment. And also, it's a good idea, if you're not doing DNS logging, it's a good idea to turn that on now, because you can find some really interesting things with your DNS logs. So if you have all your DNS logs in a database and you say, show me the least popular DNS queries, you can actually find some anomalies, and you may be able to find some C2 traffic there. Or, in my case, you also may be able to find, like when your admins are surfing porn, but they're on the VPN from home, so they don't think that their DNS queries are going through your company's DNS server, but split tunneling wasn't turned on. So, yeah, we were looking through DNS logs one day, and we see, like every morning at like 9 a.m., there's a certain website that's hit. And it turns out, like after we did some discovery, we're like, okay, well that source IP that's making that DNS request is part of our VPN pool. Let's see who's tied behind that. Oh, it's one of our admins, and he works from home. And every morning, like I guess that's just how he got his day going, you know, like. I got to do some Active Directory architecture, but first, it's like, if you're going to do that, word of caution, turn off your VPN first, just in case. A little bit about intrusion detection and prevention. So let's say you've got all these other stuff and all the other stuff in place, which is actually really hard to do. But let's say you've got all the other stuff in place and you want to look at intrusion prevention or intrusion detection. So it really, in my opinion, kind of breaks down to Suricata and Snort. As you probably all know, SourceFire was bought by Cisco, and they've turned one of the rule sets for Snort into the Talos rule set. Suricata and Snort can both consume the same rule sets, but oddly enough, Snort is actually better at consuming the Talos rule set. I don't know how that works out, but so if I were to recommend one, I would go with Snort simply because you have more signatures available to you. And for those of you who are looking for a TAP, this is an awesome cheap gigabit TAP. It's the Netgear GS105E. So you can actually use this as a TAP, and I used it at the DOE when I was doing full packet capture for some analysis with a tool called Moloch, if anyone's ever heard of Moloch. Full packet capture tool, you can carve executables out of it. But like for $35, you can have a TAP. It fails closed, keep that in mind. So don't put it in line with anything you care about. But if you're doing some malware investigation or something like that and you want to tap a box, it's a cheap gigabit TAP. So basically, port mirroring at 1 and 5, and you plug in the uplink, or 1 and 4, and you plug in the uplink at 5. For host-based IDS, you're pretty much at OSSEC. So for those of you not familiar with host-based IDS, it's essentially watching those core system directories, and it's going to notify you when anything changes. So if something like malware gets on your system and it tries to change core system directories, you're going to be notified, and then you can start your incident process, which you had documented earlier, right? Because you're not going to write your incident response program as you're working an incident. That just doesn't make sense. And we talked about planning earlier and why it's important to have a strong foundation. So breaking away from the technology a little bit, I still think that our biggest weakness is the human and human education. I think for some reason we've taken, I think the InfoSec industry as a whole has kind of taken this, our users are stupid, our admins are stupid, we're smarter, and we can hack all the things. But I think we need to take a step back and kind of use our knowledge to start educating others as to what makes us insecure and how we can harden our systems. And so taking that role, I think user education is really important. And typically the way when we do pen tests, and like I said, I'm not a red teamer, so it's not me that's doing the pen test, it's a partner. But anyway, when we do pen tests, the way we get credentials is phishing. So it makes sense that we would do some phishing training, right? And there are some good tools out there, open source tools that you can do, or not open source, but free tools that you can use. So Phishing Frenzy is one of them. The Social Engineering Toolkit, I don't know who wrote that one. Some guy named Dave Kennedy. Anyway, Social Engineering Toolkit's a good one to use as well, or GoFish. And so all of these tools, you can basically create phishing templates, send them out to your users. Obviously, get it approved through HR first. That's extremely important. Don't just start phishing your users because it's fun. And then metrics are important from this. So maybe send out something that's really like low level, easy at first. Get the metrics from that. Now you have your baseline. You can figure out, okay, here's where all of our users are. Here's where we need to be. And then start doing some user education around that, some training. But come at it from an education perspective and not, I can't believe you clicked on that link, you're such a stupid user. Because we see that a lot, and it's like, well, that's not helpful. I don't want to learn from somebody who's telling me I'm an idiot. So using these tools in your environment, I think, is extremely important for user education training, but also training your admins. Your users aren't the only ones that are being targeted for phishing attacks, and more often than not, your C-levels are being targeted as well. And isn't it kind of odd that, like in most organizations, C-levels have the least amount of security controls around them, even though they're the most targeted? Like I worked in an organization where we were rolling out two-factor authentication, and they didn't want to be bothered with like having to say yes on the phone. But yet, there are plenty of examples of how C-levels are targeted for spear phishing campaigns and how companies lose multiple millions of dollars, and yet we can't be bothered to push yes on our phone. And I think that really comes back to education, taking that role of an educator to show, those C-levels, hey, this is why this is important. Here are some examples of how it's happened in other companies. And if you can put it into a monetary amount, that's really what they care about. So I know I sped through this, probably because I'm nervous and I had to only drink half a Bloody Mary. But some parting thoughts. I think, throughout our organizations, regardless of our budget, our requirements don't change. If you get breached, your excuse isn't going to be, well, I didn't have enough money. It's like, that's not going to fly. So, we all are required to secure our organizations. And there are a ton of tools out there that you can use to secure your organization. So you don't need money for tools. You need money for people, of course. So it's not free. But I would argue that you can be just as a secure organization as someone who has, $1 million a year budget for tools. I really think the foundational step is where people fail. They want to jump into all the cool and sexy stuff, and they forget about how important policy and procedure and documentation and picking a framework to build their security program on is. And I think if we can focus on that first, it makes a lot of sense, because if you don't know why you're doing the things you're doing, then why are you doing them? I think another thing that makes a security practitioner a good practitioner is staying curious. Always be seeking knowledge and always be trying to figure out ways where you can improve, even if it's not really in the realm of security. If you see an inefficiency in your configuration management process, or if you see an inefficiency in the way that help desk staff are provisioning users, go help them out. You probably, security is not an entry-level position. You probably have a background in network administration or systems engineering, and a background and knowledge that those help desk folks don't have. So go lend a helping hand, and be valuable to all of the pieces in your organization, and not just security. Again, I think it's really important to document everything. I don't know where the idea came up that if you have all the knowledge in your head that gives you job security. It just kind of makes you an asshole, in my opinion. You should be sharing knowledge and wanting to build up other people who don't know as much as you. That's why you should exist. You should want to bring everyone up. And if you're the smartest guy in your organization, maybe it's time to jump ship and find a different organization where you can learn from others. That's just my personal opinion. I think an internal wiki is extremely important for that, whether you use SharePoint or MediaWiki or Confluence, but document it somewhere where other people can find it. And then finally, don't treat people like idiots. I think, like I said earlier, our role as security practitioners within organizations is really an analyst, trying to educate others, trying to assess the situation, educate why vulnerabilities exist, why they may be critical and how we can fix them, and then working with different business units on how to make sure that we do that without breaking anything. If you come at it from the perspective of, I can't believe we have all these vulnerabilities, you guys are all idiots, probably no one's going to want to listen to you or work with you, and then it's going to be really hard for you to secure your organization, especially when no one wants to work with you. So those are all my parting thoughts. Are there any questions? No questions. Yes. Right. Yeah, so the question is, when you're leveraging open source tools, how do you balance that with full-time employees? Because generally it's going to take more time to manage the open source tools than something like a commercial off-the-shelf tool. So in my experience, whether it be an open source tool or a COTS tool, they generally take this same amount of maintenance, planning, care, and feeding. When you buy a commercial tool, of course you have support with it, but more often than not, it takes the same amount of effort into configuration. So really, I think the skill set you want to look for is someone who's comfortable in Linux, because most of the majority of open source tools are Linux-based. But I'm going to take a guess in that most security practitioners also are comfortable in Linux. So I don't think it takes more full-time employees, really. I think it takes more of that willingness to learn and that curiosity. Does that answer your question? Thanks. Anyone else? Yes.
How much of it can be invested in trying to work with other parts of the IT department? So if you're getting networking infrastructure, you can get stuff that's more security instead of just
Yeah, gotcha. So the question is, how much of it is actually invested in working with other parts of the IT, or other departments in IT? So making sure, for example, if IT wants to buy a new switch, you want to make sure that it has certain security features in it. Is that correct? Yeah. So I think building those interdepartmental relationships as a security practitioner is extremely important, because not only do you get to build trust, but then they start to rely on you for recommendations. And so if you're out there and you're constantly talking to other departments in IT, whether it be network engineering, systems engineering, help desk, when I worked at the other company that I was talking about earlier with that DLP scan, I worked a lot with internal audit, not an IT function at all. I worked with legal departments. So I think in that scenario, as a security practitioner, because you're going to touch not only data security, but also just security throughout the organization, physical security, stuff like that, the more departments you can get in with and talk to, the better. And I think, when you get into an organization, if you're the new guy, it also helps to kind of sit down with your users and watch their workflow. And I think that's important because as a security practitioner, if you're going to say, hey, we need to implement this new tool, or we need to implement this new firewall, and you don't understand your user's workflow, if you break your users, it's going to be really hard to gain their trust back. So understanding that is important. But I think the security role in any organization, I think there's a lot of politics involved in that as well. So if you can get out and you can meet with more people and more departments, the more the better. But to answer your question just succinctly, yes, definitely be working with other IT organizations and trying to lend a hand and lend your expertise where possible, because they're going to lean on you and trust you for advice in the future. Anyone else? All right. Well, I'm going to finish this Bloody Mary and go back to Dayton. Thanks.